Hi, I'm Yulia, and this is Burning Questions. The topic that set the internet on fire this week, especially after Zelensky's interview, is what does Russia really want and why peace talks are not a solution to lasting peace. And today with us we have Oleksii Kovzhun to help us answer this question.
I'm Oleksii Kovzhun. I work as political consultant in peacetime, of course, and media analyst.
Amazing. And in wartime, what do you do?
Wartime, as every Ukrainian citizen, I'm trying to be useful for a war effort.
By having a very interesting segment on a YouTube channel called Long History, right?
Yeah, I also help some military regiments with the image, with the media presence, so to speak.
That's amazing. Well, so you're probably one of the best people to talk on this subject about. I'm sure you have seen the very famous or infamous, I don't know, depends who you ask, interview of Volodymyr Zelensky with Lex Fridman, a far-right American YouTuber that has kind of blown up the internet recently. And there were a lot of really great things that Zelensky said. I personally think he did a fantastic job in that interview. But what kind of struck me is that even after 3 hours of being explained like to a 5-year-old, Lex Fridman still kept coming back to this idea, or a dream, as he said, of peace and peace negotiations between Putin and Zelensky, and the idea of sort of like, stopping the war. So what do you think about that? And why do you think Western people still 3 years into it keep coming back to this idea of peace talks with Putin?
To be honest, I'm quite envious to Lex Fridman and all of his colleagues, because I do agree with them that peace is much better than war, that death is worse than life, and to kill people is actually bad. So I can understand the attitude, like you just stop doing what you're doing and everything will be great. And the news would not give me a bad mood, would not irritate me, and everything will be great. So I can understand the motives, but unfortunately I don't have this luxury. I'm in this war since 2014. I went to to Donetsk in March of 2014 as advisor to the governor. So it started on my head, so to speak. And I do remember when I was talking with my Western friends that this war is not against us; it's against you. We are just a battlefield. They were like, they clapped me on the shoulder, they hugged me. They didn't hint that I'm crazy, but they thought it. Because at that time it was perceived as a local conflict between the real country and its ex-province, the new country, which is not true. But let's be honest, we appeared on mental map of Westerners in 2024, because before Russia was all over the place. So the map of Europe from Western point of view looks like, if you fly over it, it's Britain, then France, then Germany, then Poland, then and Kremlin and Moscow. So we were a huge blind spot with 45 million population, ancient culture, and great and old history, but we were in the shadow of Russia. So it was comfortable to perceive as somewhere in Europe, but it's local conflict. But now the same people that I'm speaking with after more than 10 years, they see that actually it's war become global. If you would see what went in Syria when just a handful of rebels took the country, liberated the country in 11 days, you can understand that it's not two different wars, it's one. Because Russia wasn't able to supply military machinery to Syria because it's stuck in Ukraine, and Iran got beaten up by Israelis. Their proxies were beaten up by Israelis, so they were not able to send people to Syria. So it's not two different wars, and it situation that's going on reminds me of say 1939, beginning of the year, when from global point of view there were some local conflicts, like Italians in Africa, Soviets in Finland, Germans in Czechoslovakia. It's different local conflicts. Let's just appease them, and let's make it stop.
Yeah.
And then very fast they understood that actually it's not a lot of different conflicts. It's one war, and it's Second World War. It's a great war. And now, if we would look at what's going on in Africa, what goes with Hasids in Yemen, what goes on in the Red Sea, what goes on in Syria, what goes on in Ukraine, it's the same and one conflict. And the problem with it is that bad guys already have their axis, the evil axis. Russia, Northern Korea, Iran, and China as a backer. And they are already at the battlefield. And we are fighting for Western axis that they don't understand that they challenge to the battlefield. And it's sad, but then again, it could be understood that please just stop.
Yeah.
And everything will be all right. But the problem is that Russia is fighting not against Ukraine. It doesn't need Ukrainian territory, it doesn't need Ukrainian people. Well, it would like to have Ukrainian people, to mobilize them and to use them in second phase of the war against Europe, the war against NATO. They dream of proving fifth chapter of NATO of NATO book to be inefficient. Like, let's imagine, tomorrow we stopped. French sent their dragoons, or I don't know, who will try to appease at the front line. And do you think that Russians would just demobilize almost 1 million troops at the battlefield?
No.
Of course not. There is no point. But if they would send them to, say, Finland, they would take the country in 10 days. Because Finnish already did the war gaming, and then they understood that they could stand, well, at maximum for 10 days. And NATO or no NATO, they just don't have enough troops. They don't have enough tanks, enough planes.
Yeah.
And I know that the idea of freezing the conflict scares Nordic countries, maybe even more than Ukrainians.
Because that frees up troops to go to the north.
Absolutely, absolutely, and they could do whatever they want. Lithuania would stand for a bit more than a week. Estonia will be taken in 5 days. It's small countries, and if we stop this conflict, if we just say, just stop shooting, stop killing people, and thing is that. Problem with negotiations with Russians is that don't play in win-win result of negotiations. Then they don't even play in win-lose. Because if I'm Russia and I'm negotiating with you, the only result I'm happy with is when I win, you lose, you suffer, and you understand that you suffer because Russia is great. So it will be a new chapter for dear old Trump to get into negotiation with Putin. I would like to quote Ukrainian President Leonid Kuchma, who said, to become Ukrainian nationalist, you have to go to Moscow for negotiation once.
Yeah, I agree with him on that as well. I think one of the biggest things that people are missing when they're talking about negotiations and about freezing the conflict is, right, like, what's the result? Because they think that, so freezing the conflict, Russia gets, in order to freeze the conflict, Russia needs to get what Russia wants, right? And to them, it's like some areas of Zaporizhia, some areas of Kherson, some areas of Donetsk, and some areas of Kharkiv, right? So let's just give it to Russia. Okay, let's say we gave it to Russia. But do you really think Russia wants territory? Russia is the largest country on Earth. There is nothing bigger than Russia. Russia is not waging this war for more territory, because even if it says that there are Russian speakers that are being oppressed or something like that, there's so much Russia for them to move to, right? There is so much Russia in general. So this idea of Russia taking back its land is kind of stupid because Russia already has so much of it, and Russia can barely take care of all of its land. It doesn't need any more land. This is not about land. This is about domination. And this isn't even about, taking what's theirs or the idea in their head of taking what's theirs. It's about revenge, and it's about being and it's about domination, right? Because this war is more cultural. Russia is not happy with losing its grip. It's an empire that was stripped of the territories that it used to control, and these territories are thriving and objectively doing better than Russia is, and Russia can't stand to see it. And they are moving towards Russia's biggest adversary, which is the West. So in reality, it's not about territory at all. Russia would not take any territory if that meant that Russia could destroy the West, the Western values, and destroy, I don't know, the ability or the desire of any Ukrainian, Lithuanian, Latvian, and Estonian to have anything to do with the West.
Absolutely, but when they speak about they started this war because they were afraid of NATO at their threshold. With Finland and Sweden in NATO and Russia being calm about it, you can see that it's just a pretext. So the idea is to rewrite the world order.
I will interrupt you with the propaganda talking point, because every single time I say that, there is always a troll coming out of the woodwork somewhere who says, well, these countries are small. Ukraine accounts for most of Russia's western border.
Yeah, but let me paint you a picture. In Greater London, there are 300,000 Russians living at the moment, mostly in some well-to-do neighborhoods. Some of them are left Russia because they are anti-Putin. Some of them had problems with law and they left Russia. Anyway, so what if tomorrow this Russian submarine just appears in Thames River, and the captain says in a loudspeaker, we would like you to switch into Russian language the minutes of London City Council because Russian speakers want to have their voice. Because as we know, as Putin said, Russia is the country that ends nowhere, that it doesn't have any borders. And this idea sounds strange to Western ears, but then again, when they speak that, well, Kharkiv was a Russian-speaking town. And it's so interesting that they see what's going on here and they forget about some Russian-speaking districts in New York. What's its name? Brighton Beach, where a friend of mine came to the shop and a small child was shouting in Russian, "Mom, Mom, foreigners came," because they were speaking English, and the shop had nothing to do with, they didn't have a single English letter inside. So what if this district would decide to join Russia?
Yeah, I'm very familiar, intimately familiar with Brighton Beach because I've lived in New York for 14 years. New York City is my second home, and I have been to Brighton Beach maybe a total of 20 times in those 14 years when I wanted to buy good buckwheat because the US does not have good buckwheat. It's just sort of porridge that disintegrates as you cook it. So I would have to subject myself to going to Brighton Beach to get some, Eastern European groceries. And one of the reasons why I so despise going to that area is because while I was born 3 years after the Soviet Union collapsed, I feel like the most vivid example I've seen of the Soviet Union is Brighton Beach. Because it's sort of
Yeah,
every
it's
single
stuck in the time. Yeah.
it's stuck in the time for one, and for two, what Russian speakers, first of all, it used to be Little Odessa because it's on the beach, and a lot of Jewish people from Odessa moved there. But then obviously they were Russian speaking because of all the imperial imposition. And so Russians, when they started moving, of course, they don't want to integrate into the society. They just look for Russian speakers. So they kind of took over the area. And the interesting thing that's happening in Brighton Beach is exactly what was happening in the Soviet Union. Every single nationality that has moved there, be it Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Ukraine, literally anything, they just all become Russian. I mean, they don't separate themselves by nationalities. This is now the Russian neighborhood of New York City, and everybody that lives there is Russian and speaks Russian, and everybody just integrates into this, like, sort of Soviet culture of the Brighton Beach. And I've never seen anything more bizarre and more disturbing than that, because again, I've had, I guess, the luck of being born post this time and sort of like living in the independent Ukraine since I was a child. But when I went to Brighton Beach for the first time, I think I understood what the Soviet Union was like in a way, except without, repression and a lot of the horrendous stuff that was going on the government level. But from the vibe and the and sort of like the way that it makes you feel, it's kind of like you lose your identity the second you get there because it's just the Eastern European identity.
Yeah, it's post-Soviet, and I like actually I like to tease Western journalists that come to Ukraine to talk about what's going on when they use the term
Sorry.
ex-Soviet Union,
Hmm.
and when French said that well, you see, Ukraine is ex-Soviet Union, and they tell them that fantastic, then French is ex-Third Reich,
Yeah.
and they don't. It. But historically, it's correct. Well,
Yeah.
not all France was in Third Reich. Some part of it was independent, but most of it. So we can call Russia ex Mongolia
Yeah.
because they were all over the place. But this kind of thinking, while it sounds funny, it opens a huge bucket of worms because maybe some other countries would remember that in 12th century it was ours, or actually there are some people there who speak my language and they want to get there to protect them. And then again, when people speak of peace agreement, they don't count that this war is not classical war
Hmm.
with tanks and planes. Well, there are tanks and planes and soldiers dying, but what about cables, internet cables in the sea? Was it act of war? Nobody would like to think about it as act of war because they would have to
Yeah.
do something. Um, the election, boosted elections in Romania, was it an
Yeah.
act of war? Because Russians use that, they call it salami method.
Hmm.
When you don't directly, you just slice beat by beat by beat by beat by beat.
Hmm.
And so let's imagine that tomorrow, again, tomorrow, everything's signed, French dragoons on the ground, the peacekeepers, which is interesting because what mandate peacekeepers would have and what weaponry do they have? Do they have rockets? Do they have drones? Do they have anti-drones? Or is it just
Exactly.
well-meaning guys with pistols, with mandate to say, please don't? So we have this great people on the ground, and everything stopped. And then couple of couple of drones come. Is it act of war? We don't know. But the problem is that when you understand that the war goes on in a lot of different fronts, economic, energy front, culture front, and diplomacy
Information.
front. So if any paper is signed with Putin, it doesn't matter which one. Putin signs and somebody other, preferably American president, because he wants to get back what he thinks his imperial dignity. If they sign the paper, it's a huge victory for them, and because it means that so we were right, you are soft. So now we can do whatever we please.
Exactly, because Russia doesn't care for papers. And like you mentioned, you know that this war is not only fought at the front line, it's also fought in culture and diplomacy. And I think that the majority of it is really fought in the information space, but really, I mean pop culture, right? And I'll give this example of what Russia wants the world to think and what Russia has sort of driven the world to perceive. Like we talked about Brighton Beach, right? I don't have that many friends that are Eastern European in America. It so happened that when I moved there, I just, all of my friends were, anything but Russian speaking or Ukrainian speaking or, someone who had anything to do with any sort of country that has ever had anything to do with the Soviet Union. I have one friend. And she was born in America. And she sent me a meme the other day, or rather, it was a video. And it was sort of like what it's like, POV, you're traveling through Eastern Europe, right? And the idea of this video was kind of to illustrate really Russia. Like bad roads, oh, don't go to that place, you can get shot there, or like, oh, don't go to that place, there is no electricity, or like, oh, if you meet Uncle Vanya, like don't let him give you vodka because it's actually moonshine and you're gonna end up in this village for like the next 5 days, right? And the thing is, it's funny and it's relatable because I know what this video is talking about, right? And as in, like, I can picture crystal clear every one of these situations, and they do happen. But what Russia has imposed on us is that they happen to us in our country as well. As in, this happens in Ukraine, this happens in Latvia, this happens in Lithuania, this happens in Romania, this happens everywhere, right? But in reality, I thought to myself, because it was kind of like this sort of like, oh, look, you can relate to this video and I can relate to this video. Haha, we're Eastern European, right? But I thought to myself, and I've traveled a lot through Ukraine in the past year, and this doesn't happen in Ukraine. These types of things are irrelevant and unrelatable to Ukraine. And even back when I moved away from Ukraine in 2011, they were still irrelevant and unrelatable because they weren't happening. But in our minds, they were. Because we have been kind of brainwashed to associate ourselves with this greater Eastern European culture that is really just Russian culture. And when you said someone was Eastern European, you automatically put Russian traditions and Russian sort of mentality and Russian everything onto them. So really, the whole like, oh, Eastern European girls and Eastern European culture, Eastern European mentality is really just a fancy word for saying, hey, you're Russian, right? But all of these.
It's a great way to appropriate. Like um, Russians say, actually, it's Eastern Europe, which means it's Slavs. And come on, we're all brothers. So you all are Russians. And then it's like Ukrainians are Russians, of course, but they're too stupid to speak proper Russian. So they speak that language that was invented in Austrian headquarters during the First World War. It's one of the greatest myths that they have, and it works. And um, they also, speaking of culture, I asked French and Brits, do you say that your culture is great? They just, it's our culture. The only great culture in the world that calls itself great culture is Russian, with all that Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, Bolshoi theater, Dядя Vanya, Chekhov, all that crap, and it's quite interesting. But they don't read it properly because if you read Dostoevsky or Turgenev, you understand that actually it's a literature of that explains that living in abuse is okay,
Yeah.
or it explains the right of the abuser.
Yeah.
Because uh, is it am I just a pitiful creature, or do I have the right? That's the main idea of Dostoevsky, and he says, yes, it is. And I discovered just recently that one of my, I have to admit, my favorite poets, who was Lermontov, he wrote rape poems. I mean, literally. It was fun. They were young soldiers, well, young officers, and they just played with these girls, and they cried, but we had some fun. And I was like, oh my. Uh, and I read this, what he wrote, his stolen from British romantics, that kind of melancholy prose.
Yeah.
And the problem is that when you see serial or TV series on Netflix, they use Tolstoy as a moral compass. I read Tolstoy, oh, so you know what it's all about. And I know how it works, and Russians spend like billions of dollars and billions of pieces of gold, because they do it for 100 years in caviar diplomacy, where you bring some cultural event and you pack everybody with vodka and caviar, and you give them great gift, and they come back home tipsy and happy, and remember that Russian culture is great.
Great.
And actually it gives them kind of special status, like they crocodile. So everybody knows that they crocodile, and if you provoke the crocodile, it's your fault. You know that they are crocodile. Silly you. Don't do that. Don't just do that. So it's quite interesting to read all the authors on that peace process. Well, you just have to seize your territory. Okay, can you seize your territory? And the thing is, what people forget, and they try to forget it because it's very uncomfortable, that what happens on the territories that Russia managed to hold now is the hell on earth, it's torture, rape, senseless violence, and well,
Yeah.
it's hell. And it's not a question of territory, what kind of ground we should sit. It's a question of people who who stay there, who are suffering new part of Russian world.
Well, yeah, there is also this big great lie about the great Russian culture, right? Is that it's lacking substance. And I'll give you an example, and I think Westerners never think about it, and I hate the word Westerners, but it just sort of summarizes the Western world. One is kind of, well, this is not necessarily about Russian culture. This is kind of like about double standards, right? You know, European people from any country in Europe laugh at Americans when Americans say European culture. There are videos online, being like, which European culture? And they show Italians and French people and Spanish people because it's all different culture. You can't just say European culture. It's not a thing. But then when you say Eastern European culture, for some reason, it's a thing. However, we are all very different. Latvians and Ukrainians do not share any sort of cultural similarities in terms of, traditions and like historical, I don't know, holidays or anything like that, right? Neither do Romanians. If you go to the Balkans, they have their own rituals and their own sort of life and everything. But no one thinks about it that way because when they say this Eastern European culture, they think matryoshkas, right? So great Russian culture. Everybody can talk about bears, vodka, and matryoshkas. Okay, the only real thing here is a matryoshka. What's the purpose of the matryoshka? There is not a single purpose to the matryoshka, right? Like there is no meaning behind it. It's just a nesting doll that was actually stolen from the Japanese dolls because those actually come from Japan. If you take Ukraine, for instance, our version of the matryoshka would be motanka. And motanka has a purpose, right? Like it was given for weddings. It's a symbol of protecting your household. There is so much going on. Like it's you don't just give it to someone because Motonka is from Ukraine, it represents Ukraine. How, we don't know. You give it to someone for their wedding. You give it to someone when they move. It's a protection of your house symbol, and we have millions of those. Well, not millions, but tens, definitely. Right? We have diduks. We have all of these different things. But what's the purpose of matryoshka? Matryoshka is part of great Russian culture. Do you know what the purpose of matryoshka is? What does it symbolize?
It's trophy. It's taken from Japan during Russian-Japanese War in 1905. That was supposed to be, actually, that war was started, it's great that you mentioned, that war was started to stabilize the situation in Russian Empire. The idea was to have small victorious war. And it didn't work that way. But the idea to start the war, as Putin said, движуха, that was the idea behind it. So matryoshka is that. It's just like, look, I brought it from the country because they didn't have toilet seats that they steal from Ukraine. And before they stole it from Georgia during the Russian-Georgia war in 2008. But then again, problem with them and problem with the culture that it somehow they managed to get a unique place. Like they're Russians, they're infantryable, but they're interesting, they're funky, they're drunk, and it's okay. So let's party like Russian oligarch. Or that movie that took some golden ball in Cannes about Russian guy who having fallen in love with sex worker and his parents are not
Anora.
happy and they're oligarchs. I mean, what's going on? But they're so interesting. They're funky, a mysterious Russian soul. And I know what mysterious Russian soul means. It means, well, when military tortures somebody, it's war crime. But at least they can understand the purpose. Like they need to know where is the bomb, how many people in that regiment. It's horrible, but it has at least rationalization. But when in Bucha, which is 40 kilometers from where I sit now, from where I live, they tortured some old ladies. It wasn't torture, it was fun. Because she didn't have any information. They didn't want to get any information of her. They just wanted to suffer.
Yeah.
And that's mysterious Russians.
Yeah, also, it's interesting that you mentioned Anora because when I heard about this movie, I thought it was so tacky, right? And I just thought, like, this is such a bad time to release this too, because why would you want to, like, release anything about Russian culture? And I was talking to a friend of mine, so I'm not trying to talk about her in a bad light because she, in fact, is very far away from liking Russia in any way. And she's very sort of conscious in what's happening, and she kind of separates herself from Russia at all. Her grandparents moved they actually fled the Soviet Union in the 70s as some of the first defectors, and her grandfather sold state secrets to move to the US. So she's kind of very conscious in that, right? But she is a Russian Jew in Brooklyn. And she is never really particularly related to Russia or to being a Russian Jew in Brooklyn. She's just someone from New York. When she watched Anora, she came back to me and she was like, you know what, I really like this movie because it sort of made me be proud of being a Russian Jew in Brooklyn. As if it's like an absolutely, separate situation. And I was like, but what do you mean, right? Like, it just glorifies Russian culture. And she's like, it doesn't glorify Russian culture. It like, Russians are painted as bad, but it kind of like has this nostalgic vibe. And I understood the purpose of that movie because one of the hardest things that Russia is having a hard time reaching is their Russian Jewish diaspora in Brooklyn, because they don't necessarily feel Russian at all. Right? And they don't necessarily like Russia. They don't necessarily care for Russia. And this is one of the diasporas that they sort of have zero connection with because they're just American. They're just American Jews that have some sort of a Russian root that they don't necessarily connect with. And this movie made all of these people, this separate group of people, relate to it and rediscover their kind of like Russian roots and maybe their childhood and how their mom made them kasha and maybe when they had an uncle who brought caviar and who was drunk all the time. And even though Russians are painted so badly in this movie, right? it gives you a connection. It gives you something to relate to.
Absolutely. Yeah, and it's also they painted badly, but they're funky, they're interesting, they're colorful, they're special, they're different. Of course, they're bad, but they're funky. But
Yeah.
you have to remind your friend that she definitely knows two Russian words, and she didn't know that they were Russian words. Um, it's compromat and pogrom.
Yeah.
This is great. This is two great um, things that Russia gave to the world culture because pogrom it doesn't translate into English or French or German, just pogrom.
Yeah.
And this is great Russia part in it. Thank you for that.
And compromat doesn't translate either. Compromat is used as a word. Yeah.
Because it's компрометирующие материалы, and in Soviet
Compromat.
habit
Yeah.
they did compromat, and everybody knows what compromat is,
Yeah.
and it's fantastic, and we have to think why French gave everybody croissant,
And
and
Russia
Russia
gave
gave
everybody
everybody
pogrom and
pogrom.
compromat. Yeah. Well, I mean, that's
That
the
kind of.
thing. I think if you delve deeper into the mysterious Russian soul and the great Russian culture, you'll realize that most of it is stolen and built on the blood of other people. It's just that, and the point is that this war, you don't end it by negotiating and giving Putin territory, because at the end of the day, it's not territory that he wants. It's imperialistic expansion, but people think of it as when I say imperialistic expansion, I think I also need to sort of clarify here that it doesn't just mean territory. It means grip. It means grip on the world, and it means control of the narrative. And, while Russia is living in poverty and most of its citizens are starving and have never seen an indoor toilet, Russia continues preaching to the world that they're this great Christian nation with Christian values and so much money and wealth and everything. And the world is eating it up. And the thing is, it's not even that you need to go to Russia to really see it. Like, these are these two very contradicting things. Great Russian culture described in imperial literature that everybody is, I'll use a modern word, simping for, right? Versus the real Russian culture, which is impoverished people who don't have gas in their homes, even though it's the most gas-rich country in the world. So really, how can you negotiate with that? And how can you really think that signing a piece of paper with someone who is, preaching the greatness of its culture, yet continuously keeps pushing their people to less and less and less advancements while the world is going more and more modern? How do you feel like signing a piece of paper is going to do anything about it? And I think that that's a great question that we've given a lot of responses to today, and I really hope that people in the West really do kind of deeply think about this, especially those that might have watched this episode. And I really hope that after asking yourself this question, they rewatch it again and really find all of the answers, because it's to someone like you, to someone like me, to someone in Ukraine, it's so obvious. But to someone like Lex Fridman, or really any other American or an everyday English person, it's not. And it's funny because it's staring you in the face.
Absolutely, but I have to tell you that Lex Fridman is actually a Russian-speaking Jew,
He is.
and knows what he's talking about.
Alexei
And
Fedotov.
yeah, and he has to be reminded of a great Russian cultural influence, pogrom, and why his parents ran to America.
Exactly.
But he, as your friend, I thank you for that Anora piece. He's probably also watching Anora and feels nostalgic for
Yeah,
that great culture, which is different and mysterious.
he
And
does.
let's appease them.
I'm
Thank you so much.
y-
It was interesting.
Yeah, it was a very interesting conversation. I will just, the one last thing that I will say is he definitely watches Anora and feels nostalgic, and you can tell that because on hour 3 and 1 minute of his conversation with Zelensky, he brought back Dostoevsky. And I thought that out of 3 hours and 6 minutes, like, he had to put it somewhere. There was 5 minutes left till the end of this conversation, and Dostoevsky had to be mentioned. So, you know, I thought that this was a very good encompassing of the Russian soul in this interview. But thank you so much for having this conversation with
Thank
me.
you.
I really enjoyed it, and I hope we can have more conversations in the future. Well, dear viewers, I hope that after this conversation, you aren't going to be wondering what's the core of the mysterious Russian soul, and you aren't going to be questioning whether peace talks might actually result in something. If you enjoyed this conversation and you would like to hear more conversations like this, please don't forget to subscribe to this channel and turn on all of your notifications. Also, please do like this video and send it to a friend so they can hear this conversation as well. And of course, leave your comments, questions, suggestions, and constructive criticism, as well as also just say hi or send a smiley face. And that will help the video greatly, and I will also be reading all of them and, of course, addressing them in next episodes. Thank you, and see you next time.